we were also, in fact, we started with the FE, PD, and BI waivers, and then the project got extended to IDD. But the goal is to have a universal assessment with a common core of items that can apply across all populations, such as your ADLs and IADLs, but then as needed, more specific population measures that are also on the tool. This is really important for equity and fairness to ensure that we are assessing people across different programs in a same way as close as possible, but also to give the state better data so they can compare outcomes, program goals, program needs, which is really difficult for the state to do right now because there's very little data that's consistent across these waivers. They have been siloed for so long. So to have better data that can be directly comparable. And then the fourth one, and this is really important, the goal is to ensure that the functional eligibility in out results remain the same. Switching to a new tool and not changing the institutional level of care criteria. So that is really key to some of the decisions that were made throughout the MFEI project, as well as our testing approach. All right, next slide. So this was our development process on the IDD side of the MFEI project. It was a 5-year process, so it was a very careful process, making sure we didn't skip any steps. The first step was convening a stakeholder advisory board, which, bless them, they did not originally sign up for a 5-year commitment, I do not believe, but as the project would keep getting extended, and we kept a pretty good core group of stakeholders who remained committed to the project even as timelines shifted. We also very early in the project conducted focus groups. Let's see, the stakeholder advisory board had over 30 members representing providers, caregivers, advocates, state members, and they met monthly. And sometimes more, we had a lot of subcommittees within that group that would meet more often to assist with reviewing instruments, reviewing policy, things like that. And then early in the project, we had focus groups throughout the state, and that's where we met with individuals with disability who were on the waiver or their primary caregivers to collect a lot of their feedback on what they liked or didn't like about the basis and what they felt, what characteristics or what measures or items they felt a new assessment tool should have. Based on all that feedback and kind of throughout that process, we were reviewing instrument options. Then in consultation with the stakeholder advisory board members, we saw, what other instruments are there out there that states are using. When it came to IDD, it was actually a pretty short list. And then reviewing those instruments really closely, like over several months, a lot of back and forth of reviewing those instruments. Our stakeholders would have questions. We would go back to the authors for answers to those questions, or we also talked to other states that were using those tools. So we'd circle back to them to see how they might respond to some of the stakeholder questions and guidance and advice that other states could give us based on adopting new tools and going through this process. Based on that, we selected the base instrument, and I'm going to get into that, detail that a little bit more in the next slide. Based on that base instrument, we did have to modify it, and we did that in consultation with our advisory board members. Again, that's because there was no tool that was readily available that captured our specific functional eligibility in Kansas. So we had to make modifications to address that, as well as some modifications to address what we are hearing from stakeholders on the advisory board and in the focus group in regards to things that they felt should be part of this process. We tested the MFEI with real consumers and trained assessors, and I'm going to go over those results in this presentation as well. And then that was 4, 5, and 6 were all back and forth process. We would adapt the instrument, we would test it, we would get feedback based on our testing results, and adjust the instrument or adjust the scoring algorithm as we continue to test it, as we continue to take our results to the stakeholder advisory board. So very iterative process there. And then finalize the MFEI then was the last step. And software development happened in this process too, actually in the testing process, because we tested the instrument also using the software. So the software was also being tested at the same time as the instrument. All right, selecting the NRI. When it came down to it, there were really two big choices that a lot of tools, the instruments that other states were using. There were a couple kind of other one-off options. Most states had moved away from the developmental disabilities profile, which is what the basis is based on. NRI and the supports intensity scale were kind of the two instruments, the two options in town, and they were both good instruments, and this was a difficult decision to make. What it came down to is while both tools are really reliable and valid, and both tools were used in other states, only the NRI was used across disability populations. So remember, the state wanted a tool that could also be used on the other waivers, at least in regards to the core measures, so that we are measuring ADLs and IADLs, for example, and some other core measures the same way across all the waivers. Support the SIS didn't offer that. Their tools are strictly for IDD. They have started testing them with brain injury and PD, but they aren't even in the aging space yet. So they just weren't there yet. But also, and this one is probably even more important, allows state-specific modifications. The NRI license, there are criteria, definitely there are licensing rules that the state has to follow and assessors have to follow, but there was also a lot of flexibility in allowing the state to adapt a certain portion of NRI items, but also add as much to the tool as we needed to. SIS didn't allow that at all. They didn't allow us to make any adaptations, and furthermore, you had to use their software, so you can't make any additions either. They would be like, oh yeah, sure, if you want to add more measures, but you have to do that in a separate system. So it would have resulted in there essentially being two parallel systems in order to get all the measures we needed to capture functional eligibility. And this was important because, again, neither of these tools off the shelf had every measure needed to capture Kansas specific functional eligibility instrument. We absolutely had to add measures to meet the goal of not changing institutional level of care criteria and results. NRI would allow that to happen. For us to add those missing measures to SIS, we would have had to have a separate parallel assessment option with two different software systems. That was not well received by stakeholders on our advisory board, that it would be very burdensome and confusing, which I agree. So that is what pushed us down the road with NRI in addition to that universal aspect. So that is why NRI is the base tool. They also allow us to use a shorter version for screening, and then for everybody who's screened in, they get the longer care planning version. So how did we modify it? Again, we had to modify it in order to capture our level of care criteria in Kansas, as well as to address some other stakeholder feedback. You know, we had some stakeholder feedback that said, you know, we want to better assess whether people are independent in emergency or susceptible to victimization. So that's an example of one of the modifications that we made. We tweaked some of the NRI measures when we felt like they didn't quite work for the Kansas context. We consulted very closely with the stakeholder advisory board in making those modifications. In fact, at that point, we had a subcommittee that met more frequently, that worked with us much more closely to make those modifications. And then we go back to the larger group and again, kind of continue that process of revising the tool in an iterative process and in close collaboration with stakeholders. Our goal there was, okay, wherever we have to add measures, let's, whenever possible, use other reliable and valid measures that, again, have already gone through testing. So we had access to the full suite of InterRight measures because they have tons of instruments. So when you license one of their tools, they let you use any of their questions, or they call them items, across any of their tools. So we would start there. We didn't always find what we were looking for. We also turned to the functional assessment measure um, and a homegrown assessment that was used in the state of Connecticut. And, and they were able to provide us with the background on development and their reliability and validity results so that we knew it was a good tool. That's where our behavior adaptations came from. And then we created new measures when needed, but made sure that we went through that full process of vetting those measures and testing those measures. And in some instances, we just had to carry over some basis measures. Like there was no other tool out there that was comparable, and our items, and in consultation with the stakeholders, it was determined, well, we could improve the reliability of existing basis measures if we improve those measures, if we make sure the definitions are solid, put some of the definitions on the tool, make sure that they are covered in the manual correctly, so that it's no longer as much of a discrepancy in how those items might have been interpreted from agency to agency, or having to go back to these pages and pages of roundtable notes that were meant to be item definitions, but not well organized. So, and we referred to those to find, well, this is the intent of these items. This is how they're supposed to be assessed. So just making changes to those measures from the basis and how they are presented and how they are covering in the training to improve reliability through consistent definitions and language. So that's how we modified the tool. Next slide. Our goal was to move to more of a supports-based approach. This is always a bit of a balance because when we are identifying support needs, there is it's a scale, it's a measure of where people need support. So it does, you're kind of in any assessment to a certain extent, you're always measuring some deficits, but we try to switch to, well, let's talk less about the deficits and more about the supports that are needed that allow the person to perform in that area and live in the community. And let's really think about whether these measures accurately capture what it means to be independent in the community. So for example, on the basis, there were a lot of skills that based on yes, no items, cutting a circle, taking a stairs with alternating feet. The feedback we got over and over again in our stakeholder group, as well as with our focus groups, is this doesn't necessarily represent this person's needs. Some people might get a lot of no's here, but they're still pretty independent. There are other people here that might get a lot of yeses, but they still have that, they still need more support. Does cutting a circle really capture these needs? So, and the MFEI, again, based on InterRight measures, as well as some of those FAM measures that we adopted, we switched to measures that are better meet today's best practices. I mean, the DDP is pretty quite old at this point, and assessing these things on a scale instead of one or no, yes or no. So a mobility scale, motor skill scales, communication skills, and so on. Behavior was the biggest one where we just heard the most concern about how behavior is measured on the basis. And the big concern there is it's measured on frequency of behaviors. Some of the behaviors that are asked about are not fun things to have to answer, smearing feces. But I think the biggest problem and concern was that a person's score would go up when they had a lot of behaviors. And so then they would get more support based on that assessment and that funding level. And then the behaviors would go down because the support prevents behaviors. And then the score would go back down and the person would not, their score would drop. in some instances, maybe ping pong in between being eligible and not eligible, but also the changes in the funding level. So then the score drops, you lose the support that was preventing the behavior, and you go back into that cycle of the behaviors coming back. So while the MFEI does still have a measure of frequency, it's a more simple measure of frequency, but what it focuses on more is the intensity of support need. What level of support does the person need, and how often do they need that support, and does it need to be two people support? And the algorithms are deriving from that. The algorithms are deriving from the level of support needed. So we should see more consistency from year to year. As long as that person still needs the support, then that's where they're going to be scored at. And that's where we did take a lot, because Interride didn't do a great job of that by itself. So that is where we did a pretty major modification and relied on the Connecticut tool, which was pretty well received by that stakeholder advisory board. The basis is really poor performance among youth. It was never designed to be among youth, used among youth. At some point, they came in with a children's assessment that was meant to correct for that, but that children's assessment really doesn't do a very good job of correcting for that, whereas Interride tools are built from the very beginning with the age groups, and they have a different tool for youth compared to adults. Again, we use universal measures when appropriate, but with age-specific measures as needed, or maybe age-specific definitions. What we expect from children in meal prep is not the same as what we expect from adults. And their age-specific guidance, and our training includes a lot of that age-specific guidance. This is what a elementary school, a young child, a preschooler can help with. And this is what a older child is going to start to be independent. And then our tool has an employment supports and referral section, which is completely just not in the basis at all, but was added to support employment first goals. So those are some key examples of some of the key differences. Next slide. Our method of testing. So we had 7 CDDOs participate in testing. They were both urban and rural. Consumers were assessed with both the basis and the draft versions of the MFEI, MFEI LOC IDD. The LOC stands for level of care. Assessors were trained on how to deliver the level of care tool, the MFEI level of care tool. And assessors also provided feedback, what we call kind of the qualitative feedback, what worked well for them, what measures confused them, where could we maybe improve things, how was the tool received by family members. But then the quantitative or statistical comparisons were by taking the results of the two tools and looking at them next to each other and tweaking the scoring algorithms and measures until we were getting the same outcomes across both tools. It was tested with 189 youth with IDD, 450 adults with IDD, and this was across all tier levels, including tier 0 or ineligible. And then our next slide will show us the results of, I think, our adult testing. Okay, so this is a pretty simple table, but it's a really key table in showing. So at the top we have, did they meet the level of care threshold with the MFEI? By that we mean, were they eligible? No and yes. And then on the side there, the vertical rows are, did they meet the level of care threshold of the basis? So what we want are those numbers in the green. That in 2.2% of the cases, both assessments said no, screen the person out. In 96.2% of the cases, both assessments said yes, screen the person in. We only had discrepancies in which the MFEI said yes and the basis said no in less than 1%. And then vice versa, when the basis said yes and the MFEI said no, that was 0.7%. That is considered a statistically the same result. You're always going to have a couple mismatches. That's how it works. you're never going to get 100%. But the fact that we got 98.4% is closer, much stronger and closer than the top standard we were aiming for. So that result, but that is because we went through these multiple rounds and we're like, oh, we aren't quite happy with this match, so let's adjust things. And we continue to adjust things until we got the match that it was this high and this strong. So we can look at the youth results next. And again, very similar. There were 1%, 2 cases that were screened down on both tools, just short of 98%, 185 screened in on both tools, only 2 people that got a different result, statistically the same. And I think that was my next slide, I think is my question slide. All right, so that is an overview. And I welcome your questions.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Wenderhammer, for that. I will stop sharing now, so we can take some questions from the chat, and also from the folks that have raised their hands up. Cami, do you want to go first, please?
Thank you, Brutus. I'm going to try to ask a question that you can answer in 4 sentences. Here we go. Yeah. What does the doctor do? What does the MFEI do? What does the NRI do? And yeah, can you summarize in 3 sentences?
Yes.
Thank you.
The doctor diagnosis is needed to say a person has an IDD.
Got you. Okay.
Yep. And so the CDDO will collect that before you even get the MFEI.
Got you. Okay.
The MFEI determines functional eligibility, which means that you're eligible for the MFEI waiver because you meet the institutional level of care.
Oh, wait, that you're eligible for what waiver?
I probably said the wrong thing.
Yeah,
the IDD
the
waiver.
IDD waiver. Okay, so that
Should
says,
I say MFEI waiver? Yeah, that's not a such.
So doctor says you have IDD. MFEI says you get to be on the IDD waiver. Okay.
Yeah,
now,
because you meet functional eligibility, you have it. If not for waiver services, you would be at risk of going to an institutional care facility. That's what functional eligibility means.
Okay. Okay, and then go.
And then the full NRI form, which the MFEI is an abbreviated version, the full form then is after you're screened in for services. This is now the needs assessment that MCOs will be using. They currently use 3 different tools. They use their own tools, and now they will all have to use the one tool. Now, for anybody who had Aetna in the past, they were already using this tool. And I know they aren't with Kansas anymore, but that's just to say that some MCOs are already using this for their needs assessments. So they'll all be moving to a universal using the same tool.
And we see that tool. We have access to that tool.
A question for the state.
Okay, parent guardians would like to have access to that tool.
Yes, so hi, Cami. Yes, we'll take some of those questions back. Yes, like that would be something we'll take back and, discuss. But definitely that would be a question for the state.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
And we have Johan, do you want to go next? I think you have your hand up. Hi, Johan. Please feel free to come off mute. Okay, let's take one question from chat. But Joanne, please feel free to come off mute as soon as you're able to come off mute. Let's see here.
So Rick's question is that I mentioned that skills that are expected based on age. Your daughter is 24 years old, but cognitively about 7 years old. Will your level of care be impacted by her biological age or IQ cognitive level? So that comment is more in regard to the youth assessment. For the adults, age doesn't play in. If your daughter is, for example, needs physical assistance or totally dependent for meal prep, that's where she'll be scored. The difference with youth is that we wouldn't expect somebody who is biologically 5 or 7, regardless of whether they have a disability or not, to prepare a whole meal. There might be some simple things they can do, get themselves a drink from the refrigerator, help themselves to some snacks, help mom and dad in the kitchen, stir some things. So they would be rated as, well, they would still be rated as, hey, they need physical assistance or they need help in this area, but then there's another question that says, does their disability impact their performance? So if we had a 5-year-old that was engaging in meal prep at a developmentally appropriate level for a 5-year-old, they don't get points for meal prep. If we have a 5-year-old who wasn't able to do any of those simple tasks, that are appropriate for the age, then yes, it counts. We say, oh, their disability is impacting them in this area, so they get the points for meal prep. Does that make sense? That's a complicated answer, but that applies to the youth tool. Institutional in this context. Institutional in this context refers to institutional care facilities for individuals with intellectual disabilities. So that is the institutional level of care on the IDD waiver. So waiver is saying, if not for waiver services, you are at risk of being in an institution. That's how waivers are defined and how they work according to federal rules.
And we have Joanne. I think you've been able to come off mute. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you. So I have a grandson for whom I'm legal guardian who lives in an ICF. I'm wondering if there was anybody actually that you could verify who represented those who actually live in an ICF. Because I went to the CDDO informational meeting and some of the deflective answers that I got still seem to ignore the cognition level. So my grandson, for example, is 34. He functions as a 3-year-old child. He also has extreme competing behaviors. So if you carried over something, say, for example, from the basis, like, could he ride a bus? No, he can't. Not because he can't physically, get on a bus, but because waiting at a bus stop will create behaviors. He needs a 2-to-1 staff ratio. And these are concerns that I have about the MEFI draft that I was able to secure, although it seemed like the CDDO and others have been very reticent to give that to families who are eager to review it. I did make a comment regarding one section that seemed to still presume capacity simply based on physical ability while ignoring the cognitive level. Like, you wouldn't expect a 3-year-old to ride a bus. Isn't that correct?
That's true, and we wouldn't rate your grandson as being independent in transportation either. It's based on cognitive or physical capacity. So if you don't understand bus routes, if you can't wait at the bus stop, I would need more details, but your grandson is either going to be physical assistance needed or totally dependent.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, just wanted to make sure that wasn't a carryover, because during the basis, he was consistently, he can make a bed, but he never will make a bed. He never will ride a bus. He never, there's just certain things that they presume because he was physically capable, the score was a false score. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And at the very minimum, in that kind of case, it would at least be supervision, because he needs somebody to tell him each step of the way.
Yeah. Okay.
But if somebody tells you each step of the way and you still don't understand and do it, then we're talking about higher levels of assistance.
Okay. Thank you so much.
And that was
very much.
Kind of on a different topic, not that exact example, but one of the things I remember most from the focus groups we did is that the basis asked whether you can call 911. And we had a sibling, an adult sibling, say, my brother passes this every year because he can tell you how to call 911. But when my mother had a heart attack, he did not know what to do. He did not call 911. He was the only person at home. So I think that just speaks to what you might be able to regurgitate is not the same as what a person would actually do when the situation arises. And the assessment should be based on what is actually going to happen when the situation arises. And that's why we added the emergency item, because then, you know, a lot of people then kind of spoke to that of, oh yeah, like judgment in emergency situations. It's one thing to be told, this is how you call 911. It's another thing to recognize there's an emergency and actually go through those steps.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Dr. Wenderhummel. Thank you, Joanne, for that question. I think we have Ron. Do you want to go next, please, with your question? Come off mute and ask, please.
Yes, I would be happy to. Thank you, Dr. Hummel, for your time tonight and for your work on the MIFI. It's been stated that the MIFI will determine eligibility only. However, on the KDADS website, I see it says that Kansas is still evaluating whether MIFI data alone will be used for acuity-based rate setting. So how can it be said that MIFI will only determine eligibility if it's also being considered as a factor in determining rates?
I would have to have Brutus answer that question, or someone with the state.
Yes, thank you very much, Ron, for that question. And let's see here. If said, please feel free to come off mute if you're able to answer that. But the way, and Dr. Hummel, please feel free to interject here. But the way the MFEI questions on the MIFI interface with questions on the care planning tool, it interfaces such that some questions might appear on the MIFI and also appear on the care planning tool. So if either direction, if the state wants to go in the direction of using the care planning tool for rate setting or the MIFI, the questions can apply in both ways. Now, on the question of evaluating how rates will be determined, a lot of policy work are in place. KDADS leadership are having conversations, internal conversations with stakeholders, and engaging, you know, the MCOs, some CDDO partners, and other stakeholders in determining what the best path forward would be regarding policies on rate setting. So until those have been decided and, you know, determined by the policymakers, a lot is still at stake. A lot of decisions are still to be made. However, I think, as Dr. Wenderhummel stated here, the primary function of the MFEI, the MIFI, is functional eligibility determination. That is the baseline function. Rate setting decisions are being made. Conversations are happening in the background on what would constitute rate. I mean, what process would help determine the rates for provider reimbursement. So those conversations are happening, and we will be more than happy to come back to stakeholders, engage as soon as those decisions have been made.
Well, just a suggestion, maybe that statement needs to be somewhat modified to indicate that its primary purpose is to determine eligibility. However, it could be used also as part of the determinant for setting rates and level of care. Would that be fair?
Absolutely, that would be fair, and I would definitely take that feedback, and we'll make sure that we review the language there to reflect, to reflect that purpose. But that is accurate.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ron. Yes. And let's see chat. We're trying to balance the, conversations here. Let's see. Melanie did raise. Oh, yes, please go ahead, Dr.
Yes, I was going to say I could answer that question too. I think you already answered Shelby's question, and so I can answer Melanie's questions together. Does your data have? We weren't tracking people's hours because the functional eligibility tool does not determine hours. That's the needs assessment, and that's what the MCO does. So remember, all of our testing was with the CDDOs to ensure that people were placed on the waiver or not placed on the waiver.
Thank you very much for that.
And as far as the 3-day look back, well, and I can't share the screen. I don't know, Brutus, if you have a copy of the assessment available. It can show the maladaptive page. But this is changing. You're no longer going to have to track frequency of behavior because the algorithm isn't derived on frequency of behavior. The algorithm is derived on support required and support level, which should also be documented in a person's behavior plan and person-centered support plan. So what the state will be looking for moving forward is that behavior support needs are clearly documented in PCSPs and behavior plans. And then that is then what goes into the NRI assessment. And of course, for the first time assessment, you would rely on the individual's report on the type of support that the person is receiving to manage their behaviors.
This is Robin. I hope it's okay if I jump in on Melanie's question about the data. So if there is a behavior support plan per regulation, it does need to have more than just 3 days of data, right? That's because that's a separate question, and it's, you know, you want to get good data to know if the plan is working and to track that behavior. But that is a separate question on the MIFI for the behavior support plan, but just the regular behavior data, it's just a 3-day look back period. So I hope that makes sense. So if you don't have a behavior support plan, you don't need to track beyond, or you don't need to track. You would just kind of verbally report the 3-day look back period.
And there is also an option for present but not exhibited in the last 3 days. So if a behavior is still known to occur, but didn't occur in the last 3 days, it's still being captured. That is because this is what is found to be reliable and valid. That's what people can accurately report on. The NRI philosophy in most assessment tools, the philosophy is that you should be able to rely on report and not burden families with too much data collection requirements.
Correct. And thank you very much, Dr. Wenderhommel, for this, for the questions there, or for the response there. I want to get to Gretchen. I think you're next on the list here. Can you come off mute and ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you. I apologize for getting in late. I had a meeting that went over, and so I just I'm looking here on P. Wallace at my son just finished up his basis assessment, so he's been on the waiver for a long time. And would he be grandfathered in? Is this correct, what Wallace is saying?
So I can take that.
Okay.
The July 1st of 2025, any new assessments for functional eligibility for the waiver would be done through the MFEI. What we're saying with the kind of the grandfathering is if whatever tier you're on for existing participants that are currently on the waiver, your tier will you'll continue to have that, tier. There wouldn't be any impact on you, on your services, on how you all of that works until potentially July 1st of 2026, at least until July 1st of 2026. But July 1st of 2025 is applies to new participants coming onto the MFEI, the IDD waiver.
Right. Okay, and I don't want to keep asking questions. If you're going to send out like a recording of this, because
Absolutely.
I apologize that my being late has really, I don't want to make it a problem for you. So yes.
No, at all. We will send the recording for this, and we'll send you a link to the recording of past sessions as well, as we've shared a lot of valuable data too.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you for answering that question, because that was the biggie. So, okay.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you. All right. Bye.
And Dana, you're next. Please come off mute and ask.
Hi, thank you for taking my call. With this tool being so reliable, will it still be an annual evaluation? Like, a lot of our kiddos aren't really changing in terms of maybe their diagnoses and their you know, capabilities. So if this is a reliable measure of where they're at, will we still be required to do this annually?
Unfortunately, that's a federal requirement, and we really dug into that to see if there was any latitude. And it did sound like there have some states that in the past have been able to move to a 2-year method. When that got approved wasn't clear, and it sounds like that's not something that CMS would approve again, or certainly not now. I certainly advocate for that approach, but if the government isn't allowing it at the federal level, that's not a direction we can go. You know, I think the data could tell us that there's a certain that if you are at this and this such a score, it is very unlikely that you would drop below eligibility, especially when we think about 98% of people are screened in. You would have to have a pretty big drop in your support needs or a huge increase in your level of independence to be at that risk level, you know, especially in rates, of course, complicate this. If rates were brought back in, it would be a different discussion. But especially if rates are not in that tool, you know, I, as a professional, think that's an excellent idea. CMS isn't going to go for it. I think it's something to pay attention to for if CMS starts to give different messaging or ideas around that in the future. The other thing I would say that where there is room is in the developing procedures in a software system that is based more on carrying information over from your last assessment and just maybe having assessors verify that things are still the same rather than assessing every item as if it's brand new and, you know, coming in with no knowledge from the last assessment. Right, so I think for process wise, we can at least, there's opportunity for making an assessment less painful every year. If an assessor comes in, you know, kind of having reviewed the prior year's assessment and really focus on discussing things that might have changed instead of asking every single question over and over again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wenderhommel. And to that, you know, question around, you know, should this happen annually? I think we've also had that questions in the past webinars. And one of the things that I've heard, you know, our leadership emphasizes the reliability of these assessments, the trustworthiness also gives us a good ground in the event that in the future, you know, we start seeing that drive towards less frequent functional eligibility assessments, right? Transitioning from basis, a DDP-based assessment to the NRI-based one. I mean, CMS has spoken to its relevance and reliability as well. So gives us a good ground in the future should there be a policy shift that encourages that movement. And another question here from Carity. Please come off mute and ask.
Hi, thanks for taking my question, and thank you, Dr. Wenderhommel, for your information this evening. It's really helpful. You mentioned in one of the slides that during the testing process, the assessors were trained, and that certainly makes sense to me that they would need to be. I've been trying to visualize the new, what I call now the MIFI meeting to be. And in the instance that the person served has a residential and day service provider, also a targeted case manager, and active parents, what will the meeting look like? And what in particular, what I'd like to know is, how would you suggest that providers and families come adequately prepared for a MIFI meeting?
I would suggest you come adequately prepared. Well, and it depends on whether it's the first meeting, right, or an assessment. If it's a reassessment, I would really make sure that you feel your person-centered care plan is accurate, because that's what we're wanting to see consistency in, is what is, or my understanding, and I hope I'm not overstepping with what the state says, but when we made the decision that we want to remove burdensome documentation requirements.
Mhm.
That was based on the understanding, however, that the assessment and the assessment interview and the responses on the assessment would match what we're seeing in the PCSP.
Okay, and I
And
understand.
it doesn't have to be a perfect match, right? Because
Sure.
obviously sometimes the assessment reveals something that needs to be updated.
Sure.
Right. But then I think the expectation then would be when you're back a year later, we saw that thing updated
Okay.
in the PCSP.
Okay. So it's my understanding that the PCSP format will also be undergoing a change based on the charting the life course paradigm. So let's say let's say that the rollout date of the MIFI for people already on the HCBS waiver holds on July 1st of 2026. If, as an example, somebody has a PCSP meeting in May of that year, then will how will that look? Like will the new format for the person-centered support plan be in effect by then? Or how will the transition work? Or how should it work?
Yeah, I can kind of answer that question. Right now, we're contracting with UMKC, who does charting the life course, and they have been doing regional meetings. We still have a few to go, and those will be completed by the middle of May. So
Okay.
we will not be ready to start the work groups following that to develop what the PCSP will be looked like. Right now, they're gathering regional information about what families and providers and everybody's concerned about as far as what we want to see in the PCSP and how it will be supported.
Yeah, and I should clarify that we also had, said in this discussions, this isn't to say that the PCSP needs to directly mirror the assessment or bend over backwards to match the assessment. I mean, a PCSP should ultimately be, a very thorough, comprehensive document that captures the person's support needs, but rather that there's going to be consistency, right? If a family is reporting that, they are dependent in all their ADLs or IADLs or need physical assistance, but the PCSP says, oh no, they're independent, then that's quite the incongruency. So it's more that looking for consistency across the documents. We aren't looking for them to match each other exactly. And we wouldn't want that because they are, in other ways, they are serving different purposes. But in some ways, if a support need is being reported during the assessment, then the person-centered support plan needs to be laying out how that support need is being met. Does that make sense? Okay.
Thank you very much for that. And we have room for just one question, unfortunately, due to time constraint. But let's take that, maybe our last question from Melissa Westcott. Can you come off mute and ask your question, please?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My question is regarding youth, which I know there's not a lot here. You had touched on the fact that the basis really was never youth centered, and that my son has been on the waiver since he was 6. And so the basis is all that has ever been used for him. And now the MIFI, there's actually one for youth. So the basis is probably going to look like he would need more support than maybe the MIFI would. So that risk of losing services is a question there. And then kind of to go with that, you keep saying dropping off the waiver. And I'm not quite sure what exactly that means. Does that just mean he loses the waiver and can go back on the wait list that's 12 years long? I'm not sure what that means exactly.
No, you wouldn't go back on the wait list because you wouldn't be eligible. So again, it's a functional eligibility tool. It determines that you're eligible for the waiver. Our testing showed that it was for youth that we got a 99% match. So the risk that your son or anybody is going to lose eligibility because we're moving to this new instrument is very low. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Brutus, but there is a backup plan that if that were to happen, you would have the right to get the basis.
Yes.
And if the basis ruled differently that you should still be on the waiver, then that will be the decision. And that the state will be keeping track of when that happens so that we can see if there's something else that, even though we went through very thorough testing, is there something else that might need one more tweak to ensure that that we can move away from the basis permanently in the long run.
Well, I asked because he's 16 and a half, so he's kind of entering that phase where he will be transitioning to the adult. So he's kind of stuck in the middle, so to speak. And so I hate to see him on the youth form look more functional than he would on the adult form, on the MAFI.
Right, and that does make sense, and that largely is kind of a training issue and making sure that the assessors really look at our training manual and the age-appropriate guidelines. We don't expect a 16-year-old to be quite as independent as an adult in transportation, but they are getting close. So they are still rated according to that standard for a teenager instead of like what we would expect from a 5-year-old. Who we would never send a 5-year-old off on a bus, right? Without supervision. So every ADL and IADL has those benchmarks that say this is what would be developmentally appropriate for a person of this age. And do they need help? Well, just because all 10-year-olds need help in this area? Or do they need help because their disability is saying they need even more support in this area compared to another 10-year-old?
Okay, I understand. Thank you so much for answering my question.
Yep.
Awesome. And with that said, we would have to bring this to a close. Unfortunately, this has been really helpful. We had a lot of questions still, and we will continue to try to bring more, subject matter experts to come to these sessions and discuss with families and attendees. Dr. Wendell Hummel, thank you so much for making this. This has been a pleasure having you on here with your experience and expertise in this field. We really look forward to having you again